in our new series of HK45's Fireside Chats, where we speak with influential practitioners from the international arbitration community. My name is Prudhoe Deepshag. I'm one of the committee members of HK45, and I'm a counsel at Clyde & Co. As you may know, HK45 is the HKIAC's young practitioner group, and we welcome anybody who's interested in arbitration. Our goal is to support and provide a platform for young practitioners to learn and progress their careers. Membership is free. It's available to everyone, regardless of where you are in the world. So if you're not a member, I would strongly encourage you to join. Now, historically, these chats have been conducted in person, but of course, over the last few years, like everybody else, we've pivoted to virtual events. And this brings with it the huge benefit of being able to invite wonderful speakers from further afield. And that's what we've done today. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mélida Hodgson of Arnold & Porter. Now, Ms. Hodgson has over 30 years of experience as a leading practitioner in commercial and investor state arbitration. And she's represented clients such as Venezuela, Panama, Peru, and Sierra Leone. But that only really tells us where she is today. Ms. Hodgson studied at Vassar College. She began her career then as a banker, moved then to the law, and studied at NYU, joined Sherman and Sterling after that. And for many of us, that would be where the story would end, with a happy retirement. But after a few years, she decided to join the US Department of Justice as a government litigator, then moved to the Office of the US Trade Representative, where she acted as Associate General Counsel in many investor state arbitrations involving the US, Canada, Mexico. And after a few years there, she moved back into private practice, eventually joining Arnold & Porter earlier this year. She's currently the Vice Chair of the ICC Institute of World Business Law. She also serves on the ICC Commission on Arbitration and ADR, the ICC Task Force on Corruption and Arbitration, and is a board member of the AAA and the ICDR. And in addition, she's a founding member of the Washington Women in International Arbitration and more broadly a champion of diversity and inclusion. And if that weren't enough, in her spare time, she also sits as an arbitrator. So with that brief introduction, and I sincerely apologize if I've made any errors, but I'm sure you'll correct me. And with our sincere thanks to Ms. Hodgson for being so generous with her time today. I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Ben Barry. He's one of the co-chairs of HK45 and a partner at HFW, and of course to Ms. Hodgson herself. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Prid, and welcome everyone. Can I say a big thank you to everyone attending today, especially from Hong Kong, because I know it's a little bit late in the evening, so we're extremely grateful. And to all our international colleagues, hello. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Mélida Hodgson, and we're thrilled to have her join us today. So welcome, Mélida, to your fireside chat with the HK45. The process today is just for me to essentially ask you a bunch of questions, really, but if we do get questions pop up in the chat box as well, I'll direct them to you too. So I suppose without further ado, Mélida, we'll get started. So my first question, just to ease you in gently, is to ask you a little bit about your childhood and your life before law, if I may, and ask who your influences were growing up. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your childhood and about your background growing up.
Sure, Ben, and good evening to some and good morning to some. It's a great honor to have been invited by HK45 to this warm fireside chat. I'm looking forward to it. And thank you, Prid, for that kind introduction. So I guess in terms of what my influences were really determined by my background. And I was born in Bluefields, Nicaragua, which is on the east coast of Nicaragua, and culturally is really a mishmash. It is a mishmash of native peoples and the Hispanics, more from the what we'll call west side of the country, I guess, and also a lot of immigrants. We had people from all over the world, including from Asia. My godmother's name was Sylvia Chang, and so was my mother's best friend. And really, culturally, it was a wonderful place to grow up because it wasn't strange to be around people who didn't look exactly like you. And I think that was very important for a formation for me later in life. You know, I grew up, I would say, in a place where people didn't close their doors at night except against ghosts. So it was ideal. And my influences were teachers, other than my family, obviously my parents. I'm named after a great aunt who was very influential in my life when I was a teenager and in my early 20s before she passed away. And so teachers, and that continued really after we immigrated to the United States. My father was a doctor and was doing a residency here in well, not in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn, New York, across the river. And we moved when I was 10. And it was culture shock for sure. And so my first sort of real friends were really the teachers. I remember being put in an ESL class, English as a second language. And I remember thinking, but my English is better than these people's English, because really at home we spoke English because of the nature of Bluefields, which, you know, 100 years before or 150 years before, that part of what was called the Musquitia Kingdom was a British protectorate. And then American missionaries came. And so really my parents, you know, spoke Spanish, but it was not their first language. It was my sort of co-first language. And my grandmother didn't speak any Spanish. So it was a little bit strange, but the benefit of that was that these were my friends early on. And I think that continued throughout. You know, I think in college, really at Vassar, I had fantastic experiences with professors who were just really very good at figuring out helping someone to figure out what their interests were and what my interests specifically were, and how to guide you towards sort of fulfilling those interests. So I would say those were my influences.
That's so interesting that the school put you in English as a foreign language, even though it was your first language. I mean, that's surely pigeonholing at its best, really, isn't it? So yeah,
I remember we had fellow teachers of my mother in Nicaragua who would say, there's no such thing as American English, there's only English. And years later I said, I want to tell Miss Carolyn that there is American English.
But it's great, and it's a testament to you that you took that and turned it into a positive, because you obviously met so many diverse and interesting people as a result. And I'm sure that's shaped you too. So where did you begin your career after you'd gone through school and then through university after that?
Sure. Well, I began my career as a banker because in my senior year, after I had accepted a fellowship to get a master's in international studies, because I had created an independent major in international studies that sort of mixed Latin American history, mandatory economics, and political science, because I think because of where I came from, that was my interest. But I decided in my probably last month and a half of college that I really didn't want to continue to do this in terms of studying right away. And so I decided I would not, that I would work. And of course, then you come home and you're, unlike other people who've done this, you know, the spring before, you're sort of like, oh, I have to find a job now. But I was fortunate to be accepted into the training program of the Chemical Bank, which is now JP Chase. It used to be Chemical Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, Manufacturers Hanover, today JP Chase. And I spent 3 years there. I was interested in Latin America, obviously, but it was the height of the Latin America debt crisis. So there really weren't hiring for that practice group or doing much. And I went into what was then called the middle market group, which handled loans essentially up to 250 million and were regional. And it was great. It was a great education because we worked with my specific area in New York City was the garment district. And you really learned about a business and the I don't think that's the right word, the cycle, the business cycle, cyclicness, I guess, could be a word.
We'll go with it.
Yes, of a business and how they operated. And it was also an opportunity for something that I think has also stayed with me through time. And that's, it's not always a great thing, but I do well with difficult clients. We had one client that was not in the garment district, but they were very demanding. And I don't know if it was you, maybe. I get more tired of them as I go along. So, but I was, you able to find sort of what helps you to communicate with someone and communicate on their level. But I was eventually, after a couple of years, able to join the corporate group and work on Latin America relationship banking. And that's, I spent a year there. I had actually already applied to law school, but it was a wonderful, but I decided to keep moving.
It's funny, isn't it, how you talk about difficult clients, and in the legal industry, you think we're in a unique position where we have to deal with them, but of course it's complete nonsense. I mean, everyone has to deal with difficult people and difficult clients, and so much of what we do, and you can learn in other professions just the same. And an industry like banking is really not all that different, I imagine, to an industry like corporate law.
Yeah, and that matters.
And what was it that drew you away from the banking world and into a career in law, Mélida?
So, as I mentioned, when I was accepted into the corporate group, I had actually already applied to law school. I knew that I wanted something beyond, and I started thinking, well, in high school, my first love had been law. I found it interesting, the advocacy that was done. And my exposure to it in high school had really been a class taught by a criminal lawyer in Brooklyn. And as I said, I was then accepted into the corporate group, and that really kind of firmed it up for me in the sense that what I saw at the time was that the lawyers were the ones who were in charge, and it might have been unique to that situation, but it was sort of serendipitous, I guess, for me, in the sense that it was a lot of debt for equity, environmental equity, green equity, whatever you want to call it. 30 years later that was the practice, and basically you had or equity for debt, in essence, really. You had a lot of debt that was being converted, and basically the Treasury Department was saying to banks, you will do this. This was a Brady plan. You will do this. You will forgive, adjust these debts, and you will invest in, the Amazon or whatever it is. And this is the way we're going to get out of this. But you need to start lending again and figuring out a way to. We will accept certain ways, essentially, to treat it on your balance sheet.
Right.
But you will do this. And so a lot of it. It seemed to me the people who were always around were the lawyers, and that they were being told what to do from DC. So,
Well, we always get told what to do, don't we? Yeah. No, I mean, I remember I didn't do an awful lot of corporate law, but I remember spending some time as a trainee, and I always felt that the lawyers were the ones who missed out in corporate deals because it got to the end and everyone opened the champagne. This is the old days when you used to actually sign things yourself.
yes,
And
yes.
then everyone went out for dinner, and the lawyers were left to do all the paperwork at the end. And I always thought that was rather disappointing, but it obviously had a different effect on you, I think.
I'm glad to hear that, because as a junior litigation associate, I remember thinking, oh, those corporate people, they have so much fun. They get to go to the printers, all that stuff at the printers, and then they have these dinners. And, you know, yes, if you win a big litigation, your client's happy and you may get a dinner, but at the end of the day, it's a cost. So good to know.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's that tax lawyers are the ones that always make best friends with their clients. I was always told. Yeah. So, so you began your legal career at Sherman and Sterling. So, tell us about your life as a young lawyer at that time.
Well, and it was certainly, you know, a different time. It was still, you know, I think each generation says, oh, those were the glory days. It was definitely the glory days. You know, Sherman had something called, this was at the headquarters in New York, called the Lawyer's Dining Room, which was still this formal setup where you went, you could do less, you could do less than a full 3-course meal or something, but you know, and the idea was for lawyers to meet each other, and particularly because we were in 2 buildings, the litigation people were in the 153's 53rd, it was called then, which was across the street on Lexington Avenue. And the corporate folks were in a different building. Everybody's in the same building now, but the idea was to collaborate. But as an early associate, I would say played hard and worked hard. And it was definitely a culture that I think helped to form a lot of bonds. I can think of people today who I know are still really very close. I still have good friends from that time. And professionally, that also obviously helps you. But life as a junior associate was, you know, memo writing, maybe drafting motions to compel, discovery. So sitting in a room full of paper and going through it to figure out privilege and the like. And I spent most of my time, my early time there, on a huge insurance litigation that is public knowledge. It's the Aetna, I don't remember the full name of it, but it's Ray Meridian, I think it was called. It was a huge fire that happened in a commercial building in Philadelphia, and the results of sort of the debate, the fight between the insurer and our client, the owner, over how to repair that, which served me well in terms of the future of understanding that, you know, you work collaboratively with other people. Yeah. In that case, particularly important were structural engineers, and you know, we're all different. We all have personalities, and it was really kind of a cast of characters. So I did that, and I had my first arbitration experience, which was really wonderful. But for the most part, it was the life of a junior associate was memo writing and you know, doing the sort of the basic work in document exchange, or not exchange, discovery.
I always have this idea though. Was this in New York in Sherman
Yes.
at the time? Yeah, I have this idea that it would be a bit like a John Grisham novel though, for a firm like that in Manhattan at that time.
Yes, it wasn't modeled after nothing.
Sleeping under the tables and things. Yeah.
There were some people who did that, and you know, I think today we look at that and think that's absolutely crazy. But yeah, it was.
It builds friendships as well in a weird way, doesn't it? I mean, when you've really had to rough it through due diligence and discovery exercises in the early hours, day after day, it builds strong bonds that stay with you forever.
Yeah.
So after 4 years at Sherman, though, you decided to leave, and you you went on a slightly different journey. I think certainly, maybe it's not so wildly different in the States, but it certainly would be in London where I trained, which is that you went to join the US Department of Justice as an attorney. And 2 years later, you were promoted to Associate General Counsel at the Office of the US Trade Representative. So in order to assist people who may not have such familiarity with the US system, perhaps you could tell us a little bit, first of all, about what those offices are, and then what it is that led you there and to take those roles.
Sure. So the U.S. Department of Justice is everyone knows, well, I think everyone might know, has a very, and the reason I say that is it has a very long arm and is probably the best representation of the long arm jurisdiction of the United States. It is the chief representative of the United States. Some might say it's a State Department that's on a diplomatic level. In terms of judicial issues, it's really the US Department of Justice. It defends the United States in basically all aspects, unless there's an agreement for someone else to do it. For example, in treaty arbitration, there's an agreement that the State Department will do it, although the Justice Department has actively participated in those cases. So the Justice Department has a civil division and a criminal division. I was never really interested in criminal law. How I got there is that it is actually pretty normal in the United States as a sort of junior mid-level associate to think, okay, if I want to truly develop my skills, the place to do it is the government. And the Justice Department, the SEC, depending on what your interests are sort of the prime places to go. There are other litigating, every, I would say, department of government in the US has litigating units, but those are, the Justice Department is the primary one. And so I joined the, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I had discovered arbitration, and what I loved about arbitration, since what I was doing otherwise was essentially motion practice and reading paper, was that you got to be an advocate. And it seemed fairly simple and straightforward. You had a couple of pleadings, you then had a hearing, it was done, decided, amazing. Not something that dragged on for years and years and years. Now, if it doesn't sound like that anymore, I agree with you, but there's hope. And so I had also taken, in the United States, there's something called, either people call it NIDA or NIDA, it's the National Institute for Trial Advocacy, and firms sent associates, once you reached, I think it was 3rd or 4th year, to a 2-week course where you went through the process of drafting a complaint, but principally focused on teaching you witness examination, whether for depositions or later on cross-examination. And I loved it. I loved being an advocate. And that to me was, I was reminded of that. And so I thought to move to the next step, I would do what a lot of people would do, which is go to the Department of Justice. And I joined the civil division because at that time, very unusually, there was a unit, there is still a unit called the Commercial Litigation Division, within Commercial Litigation Group within that division, that needed to hire lawyers. And I say this because I don't want people to think it was so easy, because in my particular experience at that time and in life, we have serendipity. It was easy, but I started with people who had been trying to get a job in that unit for 3-4 years. And that is because the Department of Justice had lost a case coming out of the savings and loans crisis, the so-called Windstar cases, where the Supreme Court, there's debate about how it was argued and why this resulted, but it resulted in a lot of work for a lot of junior associates at law firms across the East Coast. And that is that the Supreme Court decided that the government had regulatory contracts, Treasury Department, FDIC, had regulatory contracts with savings and loans when it had adjusted the reserve requirements, essentially. And so the only issue to litigate was really damages. And so again, I was exposed to experts, really economic experts, because all of these savings and loans mostly were run by people who were, I should be careful, claimed that they would have made, you know, $1 gazillion had they not been forced out of business by the change in the reserve requirements. So again, it was an experience where, and it is the government, and you are assigned cases, and they are your cases, and you run with it. You're in charge. These particular cases there were teams, but I went from being a junior to being the second and responsible for certain elements of the case. And it was sort of like, really? Okay. And that was the case with everybody. And it was just a tremendous experience. But I thought I was going to trial. It happened very quickly, and I was supposed to go to trial 9 weeks, 8 weeks after I started. And a year and a half later, we had not been to trial. And so I thought, well, what am I doing here in Washington, D.C.? I really am more interested in international, and so I should go back. I can say, hey, I skill-wise know about as much as your average 7th year or 8th year associate, and so I should go back. And I talked to some friends, and they said, well, what do you really want to do? And I said, well, I really was interested in international, and I had applied to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative when I was looking at different places to go. And I had been very bluntly told by an NYU grad, we only hire people with trade experience. Like, forget it, basically, go get some. And that was also a reason I went to the Justice Department, because they had a unit that handled some of the trade litigation, trade remedy litigation. But lo and behold, there was something now called the World Trade Organization that the United States had pushed, that the prior administrations had supported, encouraged Congress to join, and had given a lot of concessions in these agreements. A little bit as a way to show the world how to do things. That came back to bite, I would say. They had promised Congress that they would vigorously defend US trade laws. And so they needed not policy people who negotiated agreements, but litigators. And so I was, this time on a much smaller scale, but I was hired along with actually one other colleague who to this day remains one of my best friends from the Justice Department to litigate these cases. It was a lot of fun. But that was the transition, really, was the opportunity to do international work, finally.
Yeah. So, I mean, in many ways, then, your fairly brief introduction to arbitration back in Sherman and Sterling really did, you kept drawing back to that. In a way, it's a magnet that brought you back, even when you moved to the Department of Justice. So it's quite interesting how those early years can really have an influence. But I want to talk a bit about your time there litigating before the World Trade Organization, which is fascinating, I think, to everyone watching today. I think, it's amazing to think, particularly about your experience with the ad hoc softwood lumber arbitrations, because I know, they have their own Wikipedia page, these, as I found out myself doing some research, and it's incredible. It went on for many, many years, and it was an extremely complex and interesting variety of arbitrations. And then, of course, you worked in several NAFTA Chapter 11 investor state arbitrations as well, including against India, the European Union, and your old rival Canada. I say your old rival because the softwood lumber arbitrations, those who are familiar with it, was against Canada. So, I mean, this is an extremely difficult question, but what do you remember about these claims that really sticks out, and the unique challenges, I suppose, about representing your country in arbitrations, which is something that I think, you know, I've certainly not had, and very few arbitration practitioners really get that. I suppose I was going to say a blessing, but it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. So what is it that sticks in your mind now when you think back to those days?
Sure, and you know, I have to say, I mean, you know, when I went to the Justice Department, I was literally making half of what I was making as a fourth-year lawyer at Sherman and Sterling, and that also I kind of felt that it was very unjust. But starting in a few months was when the salary started to increase at exponential rates. Not that I hadn't been well paid, but it was the irony of it all. And it continues to be why people do government work in the United States. It really is, it was a really thrilling, exciting experience, and you cannot do it anywhere else. You cannot, the United States, for example, does hire foreign lawyers in different countries to handle different kinds of matters. For example, if you've got some issue with a US embassy, but otherwise, only the people who work for the United States represent the United States. I know whatever the state of the WTO is today, one of the things that has been pushed for a very long time is to allow private lawyers to participate independently. And I say that meaning not just if, let's say, a smaller country says, well, this law firm really is our, you know, our representative. That may be somewhat allowed more now, but at that time, in terms of the cases at the WTO, it was really also the dawning of interpreting these provisions. And I think for me, you mentioned the India case, which was the India Rules of Origins case. I was up against someone who had been part of the negotiations. And at the end of the day, the rules that were agreed to, because everything is by consensus, were not the rules that a lot of people wanted. And, you know, I think I really honed a skill that I think has served me well since then, to force a panel or a tribunal to focus on what the language actually says, not what people want it to be, not what people didn't get in a negotiation, but what it actually says and what the facts are. And so it was a tough case going into it. And that's the one that I remember the most about that experience, because I was up against someone who was pushing huge policy arguments, but there were policy arguments that hadn't won when the parties had agreed to the writing on the paper. And I think we may know today that the WTO is barely on the litigation arm alive. And the United States has been a big part of that. And I have colleagues who were there at USTR who left to come back. And it is a real issue, because when parties create bodies, and I think this may be relevant for some bodies being currently negotiated, when state parties create bodies, they believe that that's the way they should operate and that they should not stray from what the mandates are. In that case, I was able to focus a panel despite, you know, these panels are created, but a lot of the drafting at I'd say the first level instance is really by the Secretariat, and some would say at the higher level also, and that became an issue eventually. But it was a great experience, because I remember being told by my supervisor, you know, we're not going to win. They hate our rules, and you know, whatever, but just do the best you can. And it came out, I was like, guess what? I won. Because I think you need to really force tribunals to look at the reality, not what people want it to be, but what things actually say. You mentioned also the softwood lumber cases. And of course, I only worked on 2 of what, I don't know, there are probably like 30 of them by now.
Yeah.
Always coincide, the industry, I'd say the domestic industry is usually complaining when things are not so great in the housing market. You can connect the dots. Otherwise, it's good to get softwood lumber from Canada. But that is actually the longest running trade dispute of the United States. It pre-exists the United States, actually, as a corporate entity. And it will continue. And one thing I remembered from that experience is also something that can happen to you, which is that I remember reading there were 2 cases that I worked on, and you're reading, and back then I started from the beginning of an award, now I start from the end. But it's like, yeah, we win, we lose. Like, oh, politics, whatever it is, you know, that was an interesting experience. I kept going back, trying to figure out, but how do we get to here when we win this and this? Interesting experience. The NAFTA cases, I was really a client, which is also was a good experience to, you know, the cases are managed through an interagency process. It's a tough job for the State Department, which is the primary litigant, the lead litigant in most of them. In at least one of those, I think the environmental cases, the Methanex case, I think the Justice Department was actually the lead, because we had, and I spent a lot of time writing talking points to explain, if we lost one of these, why we shouldn't chuck the whole system. And of course, the system got chucked years later by the Trump administration. But I mean, there was really, we were getting letters back then. It wasn't as, we didn't have Instagram. We didn't have, you know, all the stuff that you could be pinging people, Twitter obnoxiously. So, you know, lots of letters, lots of calls about, you know, who signed these things and what authority did they have to do this, and, you know, tie states' hands. You know, why were our environmental laws being challenged? Our legal structure being challenged. So it was an exciting, thrilling time, but also very challenging. And then negotiations really started. And that was also something that was fun, because quite frankly, despite efforts by many, and, you know, every stakeholder has its influence. I hope people really do realize that it's not done in a back room. Constituents, through their representatives, have influence, but at the end of the day, it's really only the people who are representing the United States that are going to be in the negotiating room, as much as that may upset some people.
No, I understand. It's interesting what you said there about one of your lasting memories being the case that your supervisor said you're never going to win, and you managed to turn around. And I often think that if you want to get the best out of a lawyer, you tell them that they're not going to win. And they suddenly bring in everything they can possibly bring to bear, because nobody wants to be on the losing side. So it's interesting you mentioned that. And of course, so after this fascinating time, you decided that you wanted to go back to private practice. And it was really during your time you went first to a firm in Washington DC, and then on to Foley Hoag. I think I've pronounced that correctly. And it was at Foley's that I think you really made a name for yourself in international arbitration, and particularly I think that was representing Venezuela in numerous ICSID arbitrations. What can you tell us about that? I mean, how did you come to represent Venezuela for a start, and what do you think were your most memorable cases? Because for the benefit of those watching from home, you represented Venezuela in a large number of ICSID cases, so this is not just a 2 or 3. So what sticks in your mind looking back? And as I say, how did you come about to represent them?
Sure. So I came about to represent them because when I joined Foley, there was a partner there, Ron Goodman, who had started doing some cases with Venezuela, and brought some of those and essentially related cases. I started really with gold mining cases. And Venezuela is incredibly rich resource-wise. and gold, diamonds, as well as oil. Everyone thinks of oil, but really there are other things that are equally valuable. When I got there, there was a case called Vanessa Ventures. And so I came into that case after we had passed the jurisdiction had been bifurcated and argued. And Venezuela did not win so on bifurcation on jurisdiction. So the case went to the merits. And so that's the part that I worked on. And I think here again, it's you know, what I experienced and what I think is important is focusing a tribunal on what the law says, meaning the treaty, and what the facts actually are, and to separate the noise of whether or not you personally like a country. I think we all think that we're unbiased. I don't think that's exactly true. I think we all have, at the very least, unconscious biases. And I think in the past, at least, there have been arbitrators who had conscious biases. And you have to deal with that. But getting a tribunal to the point where you can convince them that there is just no way that you can find against this party, the state, based on the language that's in front of you, and whether or not people were thinking of the sanctity of, you know, there is no precedent, but the sanctity of international law and awards that are created, that are made under international law. I don't know, but we were able to, in the facts, based on the facts in those cases, as well as the treaty language, to be successful. And Vanessa Ventures was one, and Anglo-American is one that I also, because it was the last one that I did for Venezuela, actually, and it was a much later time. It was years after Chavez had died, and I think that to the extent that some in the public sort of had been enamored of Venezuela early on, there was more disillusionment by that point in time, and so harder to do it again, because you're separating sort of the noise from the reality of the case in front of you. But we were fortunate to have good tribunals that were able to do that. And so, you know, that's what I say the lesson. There used to be a commercial in the United States for, I don't even remember if it was telephone pages, things of a long time ago. I don't even know if some of the audience would know that those things existed. Or maybe it was an investigator and it was an ad for an investigator, something. And the woman who's gabbling on, and the guy, you know, says very seriously, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And I think that's something to remember. It's like, here are the real facts, the relevant facts. I know we live in a world today of alternative facts and fake facts, but there really aren't, it isn't such a thing. They're only the facts. And you can paint them, color them, whatever way you want to. But it's important, I think, that, you know, when you're doing cases that are difficult, that you keep your mind focused on what does it say. And frankly, if you have to admit that some things were not perfect, you do that because you get credibility. And that's always important. Yeah,
the facts, what's written down, and the law. Yeah, you're right. And keep bringing people back to that. So moving now to something a little bit different, your positions right now. You're currently vice chair of the Council of the International Chamber of Commerce Institute of World Business Law, having been a member of the ICC Commission on Arbitration and ADR. What does this role involve, and what challenges does it present today?
Right, so the Institute is a think tank, and it was created about 40 something years ago by, you know, esteemed arbitration practitioners who wanted to ensure that there was, I think, better education, better training of arbitration practitioners. And this predates the boom in arbitration. but who felt it was important to have an education wing, and it was created within the structure of the ICC, because really at that time that was the premier institution handling arbitration. I don't know that there were many others existing actually at the time. And so it has focused on educating and training arbitrators, intensive days long, and I think the PETA, so-called PETA program, is actually longer than that. I should know that better, but really days long training, a week-long training experience in all aspects of really being an arbitrator, but also acting as counsel in these kinds of cases, in arbitration cases. And more recently, Eduardo Silva Romero became the chair a year and a half ago, and Alan Tambiaya is the other vice chair. And the Institute has sort of refocused at this point to expand beyond arbitration, to really try to expand to address concerns that businesses have in addition to arbitration, because of course it's part of the ICC, which is more than the International Court of Arbitration. And so we've sort of refocused to focus also on other elements that could be of concern or important for companies to understand, and lawyers who represent companies to understand. So international contracts, going back to sort of the basics, so to speak, as well as compliance, which is a huge issue for businesses today, understanding what does that even mean. I think most of us have very limited understanding of that. And so we've also expanded the membership of the council to bring in folks who are not arbitration practitioners and who sort of have a better grip on these kinds of issues. And that's really to try to continue to be what it began as, which is to be a training ground for lawyers involved in international commerce more largely.
That's great. I feel that way, that us arbitration practitioners can benefit greatly from learning from lawyers who are not arbitration specialists, and remembering that we are but one cog in the wheel, really. Absolutely. And then also, of course, the benefit to arbitration is the flexibility. As you say, that only really works if we work with the commercial people to look at how we can improve what we're trying to do. Because if we're just another form of court resolution, then we're not achieving what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, totally agree.
But you're also a founding member of DC Women in International Arbitration. And this is obviously diversity and representation of women in the international arbitration community is something that is very close to everybody's heart, and has been for some time, but particularly I think at the moment. And what are some of the ways that you feel that the international arbitration community can work together to facilitate the greater representation of women lawyers?
Sure, and let me just give credit to others who formed the sort of core group when we founded that, and really the idea of sort of sitting, chatting at a lunch with Patricia Saiz of Spain, who sort of said, we need to do X, and it was modeled a little bit after some work that had begun in New York, actually, spearheaded at that time by Claudia Solomon. And in DC, the other sort of musketeer, the third musketeer, so to speak, was Claudia Frutos Peterson. And, I think it was just initially to allow people to have a space where they could go and ask difficult questions and to share experiences. But it also evolves over time, as everything does. And I think at this point where we are today, and my view on these issues is, frankly, not to get in trouble with Nike, I think it is, but just do it. Just do it. If we should be appointing women, you know, there's always an issue of, oh, experience and well, you know, that's a question that people get over when they appoint young men without experience or men of certain experience. So you can do it with women also, but women need to do it. Women need to help other women. We are getting to a point where women are in positions to appoint women, to hire women as counsel, because that's very important, because really the training ground comes still from law firms, I think. And so you have to hire women and allow women to be in a leadership position, to be lead counsel, to be first chair, in order to build the pool. And I think women, you know, it shouldn't be just men. I think men are great allies and you know, have to be a part of this, because men still generally are the majority in terms of appointments, in terms of hiring. But I would say, you know, everybody, and particularly women, have a responsibility to hire, to appoint, to invite, to be part of organizations that have influence in our world, and to sort of equalize. You know, I do think that, you know, all of us should be doing that, but I think women bear a particular responsibility, and not all women do it.
No. So just do it. I like that. That's that should be the takeaway for today. And I mean, on the subject of sort of challenges and challenges that obviously all lawyers have, not just women have in this industry. You've obviously had a hugely successful career, and you're talking today to lawyers, many of whom who are starting out or relatively new to their careers. And what do you think has been the main challenges in developing and maintaining an arbitration practice in your career?
Sure, and I dare say, and I think the pandemic has borne this out. I think it's a little bit tougher for women because there are additional responsibilities that still, I don't care if you're 30 or 50, apparently still are mostly borne by women, and that's just a reality. And so I think the challenge is really balancing sort of work with personal life, especially in this, what I call the post-pandemic 24/7 world, and the Zoom world, where things are easier, and that's a great thing. It meant that our world, our business world, didn't collapse in the last 2 years, but it's also created, I think, expectations that are probably in the long run unhealthy. And I think we're also seeing this in terms of the divide, to a certain extent, that's emerging between younger lawyers who already we had sort of thoughts or concerns about how do we handle millennials who, they might think it's perfectly fine, no matter how brilliant they are or whatever. They may think after 2 years, oh, I'll go open a yoga studio because that's what's going to fulfill me. And for a lot of older people, it's like, what? And so we already were dealing with that. I think in the long run, it's going to be a good thing for all of us, because we do have to have a balance. I actually don't think you serve clients as well as you could if you are 24/7 and don't have time to have a respite, to recharge. But I do think the challenge right now is balancing, and it's not even home life. I would say it's just personal life. It's doing something other than work. And it doesn't matter if you're married with children or if you are single with other responsibilities or just single. It really is a tough time. And I think as a partner, certainly the additional element is balancing work, sort of real work, actually reading a brief and coming up with ideas for it, and the business side of things, because at the end of the day, law firms are businesses. And so they're, yes, it's a nice collegial organization, and maybe in some cultures it's more of a profession in that sense. It's training future officers of the court, which I think some lawyers forget that they are, or at least in this country you are, and versus the business side of things. But at the end of the day, if you're in an economic organization called a law firm, that is also a pressure. And it's tough to balance that. It's tough to balance doing things like this because at the end of the day, it's, you know, luckily this is at 8 a.m. so I wouldn't be doing any work at this time anyway. But by that, I mean, you know, being involved in civic type of organizations and training and mentoring, that's all a balance against the bottom line, in essence, which is, you know, what can matter. And you can balance that depending on what your financial aspirations are or aren't, but it is a reality that that's also something that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, I do think it's important, actually, particularly lawyers sometimes lose sight of the fact that you're right. If you're working in a law firm, you are there to make money. It's, you know, it is an honorable profession, the law, but also, you know, it is a profession that we've all got to generate some money out of if we're working in private practice. So last question, unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of our hour, but there's one question I wanted to ask you in particular, because I know that you're very passionate about advocacy. So it's a similar question to the one I just asked you, I suppose, about, you know, the challenges of the profession more generally. But I want to zero in just on our last question here about advocacy. And you've practiced all over the world and seen firsthand so many different types of advocacy in common law and, of course, in civil law jurisdictions as well. And what are some of the main differences you've observed? And what sort of advice, I suppose, would you give to the HK45 members and others who have joined us today about advocacy style and techniques, and what works and what doesn't?
Sure. And, you know, I think where I would start out is by focusing on this aspect of being, where I ended off, being an officer of the court. And we don't have that obviously in arbitration, but most of us are barred in some place, in some country, some state. And I think it's important to remember that you have a responsibility to a tribunal, to your colleagues, to your clients, to be credible. And you know, when I started off in this practice, including before the WTO, you know, people really sometimes are just like, oh my God, these people, because the US is the US, and you had litigators coming from the Justice Department, and it was you were used to getting into court, and certainly at the appeals level, you had, I don't know, 15 minutes to put your case forward, and you might be interrupted. And so you were taught to have your 2-3 points that you needed to get across and to figure out a way to get it across. And to be as concise as possible, but to be that really good advocate. Sometimes that was seen as being a little bit aggressive, or well, aggressive, we'll call it. I have seen over time that really culturally, it's not as much the Americans, let's say, or the Brits that are as aggressive. It has evolved, and it's almost as if the students have learned too well. Both in terms of oral advocacy, which is still more tempered because you're sitting in front of people, it's much harder to be really rude. But in briefing, I have seen just a level of nastiness that I would have expected from a schlocky, you know, low-level criminal lawyer in Brooklyn. Not my Brooklyn, I love it, but I'm trying to make a point. And that's disappointing. It's disappointing, and I think it needs to change. The vitriol, the level of vitriol, the level of untruths, really, that are written in the name of advocacy. You know, and as an arbitrator, I know it doesn't go anywhere. People really just, they don't want to read it. And so you're not doing your clients any favors by showing what a great writer you are by, using too many adjectives, and especially adjectives, accuse a party of bad faith. I think if you're going to accuse a party of bad faith, you better be damn sure that it is bad faith, because you should have to prove it. But the reality is, in arbitration, you don't yet have to prove it. And that's an issue. If you're in a US court and you deceive the court, so to speak, by putting all of that in there, it may or may not be viewed as great advocacy. It may be viewed as a violation that can be sanctioned of professional conduct. And I hope that what we will get back to is with this newer group that maybe feels more comfortable in their position, their role in arbitration, is civility, because that was the beauty of that. We thought that we as Americans were being tempered by sort of cultures that had a much more civil way of practicing. And as I say, I think we've seen more sort of the not as great sides of American litigation take over. And I hope we can go back to civility, to it really being much more of a collegial practice, because you really don't gain any points by being obnoxious, playing with facts and truth. You don't at the end of the day. Maybe for a while people were, but I don't think so. So I would say, really focus on being a good professional, because the profession involves people who have responsibilities, professional responsibilities to clients and to the practice.
So stick to the facts, as you were saying, and the law and what's written down in the contract or in the treaty. Well, Mélida, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I think we had so many more questions to cover, and in our previous discussions, you said we'll never get through them all, and you were completely right. So we could have done this all over again, and it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for sharing all your thoughts and your wisdom. It's much appreciated. For those of you who are watching, who have questions, please do send them to me or to Prid, and we will get back to Mélida. We've run out of time for now. The next Fireside Chat is on the 4th of July, a very important day for Mélida and others over in the US. And that's with the wonderful Todd Beeler. So please do join us for that on the 4th of July. And Mélida, thank you so much again. And I hope we get to meet in person one day rather than over these godforsaken Zooms. So thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you, Mélida. Thank you. Bye-bye.